Wisdom, the final frontier to true knowledge. Welcome to Wisdom Trek, where our mission is to create a legacy of wisdom, to seek out discernment and insights, to boldly grow where few have chosen to grow before. Hello, my friend. I am Guthrie Chamberlain, your captain on our journey to increase wisdom and create a living legacy. Thank you for joining us today as we explore wisdom on our second millennium of podcast. This is day 1431 of our trek, and it is Worldview Wednesday. Creating a biblical worldview is essential to have a proper perspective on today's current events. To establish a biblical worldview, you must have a proper understanding of God and His Word. This week, on our Worldview Wednesday episode, we will begin a new study based on a course I recently completed, taught by Dr. Michael S. Heiser. Our study is titled, Sons and Daughters of God, the Believer's Identity, Calling, and Destiny. Throughout this multi-week course, we will demonstrate that the Old Testament sons of God and holy ones refer to supernatural beings whose Father is God and who work with God to carry out His will, and that His divine family was present before humanity. By fully engaging the biblical texts such as Psalm 82, Psalm 89, and Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 and 9, our study will show that this divine family functions as a template for God's human family. God desires of humans, as His imagers, to participate in His counsel. This study addresses such things as polytheism, the nature of little g gods, and the uniqueness of Yahweh. Within this study, we will apply the insights to the New Testament text and shows how the metaphor of being in God's family informs our sense of identity and mission as believers. Our study today is about biblical foundations, and the first segment we want to look at is God has a divine family. And we'll first look at God's divine family in the Old Testament. The place to begin our journey is to recognize that God has a divine family, and really, God had a divine family before He had a human family. The family terminology that we are going to talk about in the Old Testament is very intentional. It's going to communicate certain ideas about our identity, who we are, our calling, our purpose, and our destiny. And with that, how we'll realize both the fullness of our status, our identity, and fulfill God's purpose in this life to accomplish God's will here on earth. In other words, the divine family is actually going to turn out to be a template for understanding the creation and purpose of the human family. And that's why we're going to start and spend a reasonable amount of time on the idea of God's divine family in the Old Testament. Familiar New Testament language about our membership in God's family came from somewhere, and it has very deep Old Testament roots. God's family did not begin with humans. Humans are grafted into it. Its beginning was divine. So for this reason, we need to start with that particular supernatural family. We're going to talk about the nature of that family. Who is in there? What kind of beings are we talking about? And then its functions. As we talk about the nature and the function of the divine family, we're going to be laying a foundation for how all that material is repurposed in the New Testament and applied to believers. Our next segment is the divine family was present before humanity. And this divine family concept can be found in Job chapter 38 verses 4 through 7. Now I mentioned that the Old Testament presents the idea of God's divine family and that it was present before humanity. The primary passage is Job chapter 38 verses 4 through 7, and this is the passage where God asked Job, beginning in verse 4, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were the bases sunk? Or who laid the cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy." Now, the point here is the sons of God language. They were divine beings, sons of God. Present at the creation of the world, God had a family. These are spirit beings. We're going to be taking some time to look at some other passages that refer to the sons of God as members of the heavenly host. So we know that these are spiritual beings, and they are not by nature embodied. They don't have a gender or anything like that. The sons of God that we're referring to here are a hierarchical expression. But you might ask, what about the daughters? Why is it sons of God? Well, in the Old Testament mode of thinking, sons of God is actually a hierarchical term. If you remember, the Old Testament culture was predominantly, in terms of leadership, dominated by men, and very patriarchal in some of its institutions. And so, is not so much a term that describes what the thing is. Again, they don't have gender, and they don't have bodies. It's instead a term that describes a particular function, and we'll be getting into some of those functions as we proceed. But we need to consider that God wanted a blended family. Now, after the earth's foundations were laid, God decided to do some other things. As we know the biblical story, God decided to create a human family on earth. That family was embodied. They were terrestrial. So we have two families emerge from the biblical story pretty clearly. But the divine family pre-existed the human family. Humans are going to, as their destiny, at least their planned destiny, going to join God's family. Heaven is going to come to earth in the form of Eden. God is going to be there, His own heavenly family. His entourage is going to be there. Humans were created to join with that group. You might consider it sort of a blended family where humans would live among the divine beings. Because heaven has now come to earth, they are not so much separate domains, and that was the original intent. God, of course, is going to task humans with certain things, just as He tasked members of the divine family with certain things. So the biblical story that emerges right from the beginning is that God is looking for a blended family, divine and human. Humans living in the divine present was their intended norm. Of course, we know that that's not the way the story goes, but keep in mind the idea of the intended norm. And we see that the divine family becomes a template. The divine family, therefore, is a precursor. It becomes a template for how we should think about and how God looks at the rest of His family, which is us. So we're going to learn in subsequent weeks about the divine sons of God in order to understand how the New Testament later talks about our own identity and our calling and our own destiny. But that will conclude our first two segments of our study, Sons and Daughters of God, the believer's identity, calling, and destiny. Join us again next week. I think you'll find each Worldview Wednesday contains thought-provoking topics to consider as we build our biblical worldview. Tomorrow we will continue with our 3-minute humor nugget that will provide you with a bit of cheer, which will help you to lighten up and live a rich and satisfying life. So encourage your friends and family to join us and then come along with us tomorrow for another day of Wisdom Trek, Creating a Legacy. If you'd like to listen to any of the past 1,430 treks or read the Wisdom Journals, they are all available at wisdom-trek.com. And I encourage you to subscribe to Wisdom Trek on your favorite podcast player so that each day will be downloaded to you automatically. And thank you so much for allowing me to be your guide, your mentor, and most of all, I am your friend as I serve you through the Wisdom Trek podcast and journal each day. And as we take this trek of life together, let us always live abundantly, love unconditionally, listen intentionally, learn continuously, lend to others generously, lead with integrity, and leave a living legacy each day. I am Guthrie Chamberlain, reminding you to keep moving forward, enjoy your journey, and create a great day every day. See you tomorrow.